Midwest river town, 1912. No one remembered the first time they stepped over Samuel Crowe. That was the problem. By 1912, stepping around him had become instinct, the way people adjusted their stride when something lay in the road too long to feel unusual. Samuel slept, where the ground flattened itself for him, behind warehouses, beneath loading docks, along the river bank where the mud never fully dried. People did not see him arrive. They only noticed when he was in the way. Samuel Crowe was drunk often enough for the town to stop counting how often he wasn't. When he spoke, it was assumed to be nonsense. When he listened, it went unnoticed. That made him useful in a way no one acknowledged. I knew him before I knew his name. I was a boy then, old enough to be sent on errands, young enough to pay attention. Samuel used to sit near the rail yard, with his back against the brick wall, knees pulled to his chest, bottle hidden in a coat that no longer had a shape. My mother would tell me to walk faster when we passed him. "He won't bother you," she said. "He just shouldn't be seen." Samuel never asked for anything. That made people uncomfortable. Begging could be refused. Silence demanded nothing and still accused. At night, when the river rose and the ground swallowed shoes, Samuel would move, not far, just enough to avoid being washed out of place. He knew the town better than anyone else because it had pressed itself against him daily. He knew which factories dumped runoff too close to the water, which stores closed early, which doors stayed unlocked longer than they should. Men who worked honest jobs barely noticed these details. Men without jobs noticed everything. Samuel had ideas, real ones, about metal, about scrap, about buying what others threw away before anyone else realized it was worth saving. He once tried to explain this to a man unloading cargo from a barge. The man laughed and waved him off. "Go sleep it off." Crowe. The name stuck. No one remembered where they learned it, only that they used it. By the end of summer, Samuel had become a fixture, not exactly tolerated, not removed either. The kind of presence that defined a place without being included in it. People said things near him they would never have said elsewhere. Numbers, complaints, plans that weren't ready yet. Samuel heard all of it. On a September morning, something changed, not loudly, not ceremonially. Samuel woke up without a headache. That alone meant nothing. It had happened before. What mattered was what followed. He did not reach for the bottle. He sat there longer than usual, watching fog lift from the river, watching men cross bridges with purpose he had lost years earlier. He stood. That was new. Samuel Crowe had been upright before, but never with intention. This time he stayed that way. He walked to the river and washed his hands in cold water until his fingers hurt. He did not look at his reflection. By noon, people noticed something was wrong. Samuel was still there, but he was watching, not drifting. His eyes followed loading patterns. His posture changed. He did not ask for coins. He did not mumble. By evening, a bartender slid a drink toward him out of habit. Samuel pushed it back. "No," he said. Just that. The bartender blinked, confused, and shrugged. That would have been a story in any other town. Here it wasn't, because Samuel Crowe stopped drinking the same way he had been drinking for years, without witnesses that anyone thought mattered. And the town, busy, practical, impatient, did what it always did with quiet changes. It stepped over him. Midwest river town, 1913 to 1914. People kept waiting for the joke. They assumed Samuel Crowe would last a day, maybe 2, and then returned to the role he had been assigned, the town drunk, the cautionary tale, the man you pointed to when you wanted your own life to feel stable by comparison. But Samuel did not return. He did something worse. He became consistent. In the weeks after he stopped drinking, he didn't make speeches. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask anyone to believe him. He didn't even ask for work in the way most men did, hat in hand, eyes lowered, already bargaining with shame. Samuel watched first. He spent mornings at the rail yard observing how crates were stacked and unstacked, how schedules slipped, how men wasted minutes arguing about tasks that didn't require arguments. He learned which foremen ignored small losses because it was easier than fighting for accountability. Then he began collecting what other men pretended not to see: scrap metal, bent nails, broken chains, warped boards, anything that could be sold by weight, repaired for reuse, or traded to the right person on the right day. At first he carried it in burlap sacks. Then in a rusted wheelbarrow he found behind the shipping office, its wheel barely holding. No one stopped him. No one cared enough to accuse him, and no one respected him enough to negotiate. That invisibility was a kind of protection. By late 1913, Samuel had money again. Small amounts, but real. Enough to buy soap, enough to replace torn fabric, enough to pay for a cheap room for a week without being asked questions. He didn't use it to look respectable. He used it to become harder to remove. He learned which shopkeepers marked down items at closing, which factory clerks would sell discarded parts privately if approached quietly. He learned that what people called trash was often just inventory they didn't have time to classify. Time was the real currency. Samuel had more of it than anyone. In the winter, he did the work no one wanted. He shoveled coal dust from beneath conveyor belts. He hauled refuse from behind the cannery. He cleaned the ice from the steps of buildings where men like to think of themselves as important. He didn't ask permission. He did the work and then stood nearby until someone paid him simply to make the discomfort of owing him disappear. That was how he began to earn, not through opportunity, through friction. And there is no shortage of friction in a town that depends on routine. By spring of 1914, Samuel had something else: a ledger, a small notebook he kept inside his coat. In it, he wrote numbers and names and dates. Nothing criminal, nothing dramatic, just records. Who paid late, who needed scrap removed regularly, who always had extra inventory they didn't want accounted for. No one knew he could write well. People assume many things about men they step over. In May, a flood came through the lower streets. Not the kind that destroyed homes, just enough water to ruin basements, damage supplies, and force business owners to do unpleasant work quickly. Men in clean collars stood outside their buildings, staring at the river with the helpless expression of people who believed the world should stay in its place. Samuel did not stare. He moved. He showed up before the owners could ask. He helped carry stock to higher ground, dragged soaked crates out of the water, lifted shelves and boards and anything else that could still be saved. He directed other laborers without raising his voice, simply by acting as though the next step was obvious. When the water receded, a warehouse manager paid him more than Samuel expected. Not because Samuel demanded it, because the man didn't want Samuel to realize what his help had been worth. It was the first time someone tried to buy Samuel's silence rather than his labor. That moment mattered. Samuel understood something then, quietly and fully. People weren't afraid of what he used to be. They were afraid of what he might become once he started seeing value where they saw inconvenience. By late summer, he rented a small space near the yard. Nothing respectable, just a shed with a lockable door. He began storing scrap instead of selling it immediately, holding it until prices rose, waiting until a shortage turned trash into necessity. This is how wealth begins, most of the time. Not with genius, with patience. In October, a foreman named Dale Mercer, a man who had called Samuel Crowe, like it was an insult, approached him quietly behind the rail office. "You're sitting on a lot of metal," Mercer said. Samuel didn't deny it. Mercer looked around, as if embarrassed to be seen speaking to him. "I can get you more," he said. "Cheap, regular, but you'll need a buyer." Samuel waited a beat. Then he said the sentence that would later become the beginning of everything. "I already have one," he said. That was a lie. But Samuel had learned that people treat plans as real if you speak them without needing approval. Mercer nodded. The deal began. And just like that, Samuel Crowe became a man with a supply chain. The town still saw him as the drunk who had cleaned himself up. But beneath that reputation, another truth was forming, quietly, mechanically. Samuel had found the work no one wanted, and he had discovered that if you do unwanted work long enough, you eventually control the parts of a system everyone else avoids looking at. Midwest Rivertown, 1915-1918. Men talk about becoming rich as if it happens in a room, in a single conversation with paper spread out like proof. Samuel Crowe became wealthy the way rust spreads, quietly, over time, on things everyone else stopped caring about. By 1915, the shed near the rail yard was no longer enough. Samuel rented a second one across the alley, then a third. He didn't call it expansion. He called it storage. He told people he was keeping things out of the weather. What he was really doing was learning the difference between selling and holding. Because holding is what separates survival from leverage. The town still treated him like a repaired mistake. People did not invite him to anything. They didn't ask his opinion. They just began to speak to him the way you speak to a necessary inconvenience. Careful, short, and with the assumption the conversation should end quickly. Even the men who sold him scrap did not look him in the eyes for long, not out of fear, out of embarrassment. Samuel never corrected it. He learned early that respect was harder to earn than money, and often less useful. When the country entered the war years later, the town changed in ways it didn't fully understand. Orders became larger, materials became tighter, prices rose without warning. Things that had been ignored for decades suddenly mattered, metal especially, rail parts, bolts, chains, any usable steel. Suddenly, men who had laughed at Samuel's wheelbarrow began asking questions. "Got anything?" they'd say, trying to make it casual. Samuel always had something, because he had been collecting before anyone else remembered to. By 1917, his operation looked legitimate enough to be tolerated. Not respected, tolerated. He wore cleaner clothes. His hands were still rough, but they no longer looked abandoned. He started keeping receipts, not because anyone required them, but because he wanted the option to prove something later if proof became currency. That year, I saw him in daylight for the first time and didn't immediately recognize him. I was older, 15, maybe 16, tall enough to be mistaken for a man in the wrong light. I watched Samuel stand outside the freight office with a clerk, both of them speaking quietly. The clerk looked nervous. Samuel looked patient. That was when I understood something about him that most people missed. Samuel didn't rush anyone. He let them hurry themselves. In early 1918, the river froze hard enough to stop traffic for nearly a week. Barges stalled. Deliveries slowed. The town felt the delay like a cough you couldn't ignore. Factories began to panic in small ways, tightening schedules, cutting corners, blaming workers for shortages they couldn't control. Samuel didn't panic. He walked to the east side of town and bought something no one would have thought to buy. A narrow strip of land behind the old cannery, half mud, half weeds, bordered by broken fencing and garbage. It was useless property, the kind you inherited and forgot. He paid cash, not much, but enough to make the seller feel relieved, like the land had been a mistake he could finally erase. No one understood why Samuel wanted it. But Samuel wasn't buying land. He was buying location. That strip sat close to the rail spur. Close enough that loading could be done without competing for space in the yard. Close enough that deliveries could be staged quietly out of sight, out of the chaos. When the river thawed and traffic resumed, Samuel's small lot became a node, an unofficial holding area where metal could be sorted, weighed, repaired, and moved without delay. The first time a factory foreman asked permission to use it, Samuel didn't say yes immediately. He waited. He let the foreman explain why he needed it, how urgent it was, how the delays were costing money. Samuel listened with the calm of someone who had once slept in mud and learned to treat urgency as someone else's problem. Then he said, "You can use it." He didn't charge much, not at first. He charged just enough to establish that it wasn't charity. And that was the first investment no one noticed, not because it was small, because it didn't look like ambition. It looked like cleanup. By summer, Samuel's lot was active daily. Men began referring to it as Crowe's place, the way people name things after whoever they assume will always be there. He hired 2 workers, quiet men, not friends, workers. He paid them on time. That alone earned him something close to trust among people who had never trusted him. But the town still did not forgive him. A bartender might nod at him now. A shopkeeper might accept his money without wiping the counter afterward. But when wives spoke of him, they still lowered their voices. "He's doing better," they would say, as if improvement required permission. That fall, Samuel did something that should have changed everything for him. He walked into the bank. Not dramatically, not with a show of confidence. He wore his best coat and held his ledger like it mattered. The bank manager stared at him too long before speaking. Samuel placed his papers down gently, like he was offering evidence rather than requesting a favor. "I want to open an account," he said. The manager cleared his throat. "We don't usually—" Samuel didn't interrupt. He waited. The manager looked again at the papers, the receipts, the consistent deposits, the property deed. A man can be hated and still be profitable. The manager opened the account. He did it with the expression of someone who had just invited a storm into his building. Samuel left without smiling, because that day Samuel Crowe became something the town could no longer pretend he wasn't. He became permanent, and permanence in a place that never updates its memory is not the same as acceptance. It's simply a new kind of discomfort. Midwest Rivertown, 1919-1924. After the war ended, the town exhaled in uneven breaths. Orders fell, prices softened. Men who had learned to shout suddenly learned to wait. Businesses that had expanded too quickly searched for someone to blame. Those that survived pretended the strain had never existed. Samuel Crowe did not pretend. He adjusted. Where others saw a return to normal, Samuel saw gaps, contracts unwinding, equipment aging, buildings half used because no one wanted to admit they'd overbuilt. He bought quietly and sold slower than anyone expected. He did not chase profit. He positioned himself where profit had nowhere else to go. By 1921, his operation had moved beyond scrap and storage. Samuel purchased machinery no one wanted to maintain and leased it to factories that needed output but could not afford replacement. He bought land with bad drainage and paid crews to fix it properly. The work cost money up front and returned it later. That patience unsettled people. Men are comfortable with risk when it looks like bravery. They distrust it when it looks like restraint. Samuel's wealth did not announce itself. It arrived in increments, another deed, another hired foreman, another account line the bank didn't like discussing. By 1924, the numbers no longer hid. Samuel Crowe was, by measure alone, one of the wealthiest men in the county. The town did not invite him anywhere, not to dinners, not to committees, not to celebrations marking progress he had paid to make possible. When events required sponsors, his name appeared near the bottom of the list, printed smaller than the rest, as if the ink itself had reservations. They called it Crow money. They did not call it Crow leadership. When a new bridge proposal stalled over funding, Samuel wrote a check that solved the shortfall without attaching his name publicly. The bridge was approved within the week. At the dedication, Samuel stood at the back. No one thanked him. That suited him, because Samuel was learning something more useful than applause. He was learning the shape of influence. In 1922, a drought disrupted river traffic again. Barges slowed, supplies tightened, factories blamed the water, town officials blamed the factories. Nothing moved. Samuel moved first. He rerouted material deliveries through rail connections he had quietly secured years earlier. He paid overtime without complaint. He kept production flowing at a loss for 3 months. Then when the water returned, he adjusted his rates. Not vindictively, just accurately. Men who had scoffed at his methods now depended on them. And dependence is a language even pride understands. I saw Samuel once that year outside the post office, reading a notice about a charity dinner. His name was absent. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his coat. There was no anger on his face, only recognition. Later, a man beside me said, "Strange how someone like Crowe always has money, isn't it?" I didn't answer, because by then Samuel Crowe was no longer strange. He was predictable. That frightened people more than unpredictability ever could. By 1924, Samuel employed over 50 men directly and influenced the work of many more indirectly. He paid wages others couldn't match and demanded efficiency rather than loyalty. His foremen were told one thing clearly: work done well spoke for itself. Samuel did not attend church regularly. That alone kept him outside acceptable circles. People do not forgive wealth that lacks ritual. They forgive effort. They forgive struggle. They forgive failure. But Wealth earned quietly, without public repentance, makes people uneasy. There were rumors that Samuel had cheated someone early on, that he had hidden connections in the city, that his sobriety wasn't as pure as it appeared. None of it mattered. By then, Samuel's position was less fragile than their suspicions. At the end of the year, a banker who had once hesitated to open Samuel's account invited him to a private meeting. Samuel declined. He had learned when to say no. That night, the town hosted a gala celebrating progress since the war. Speeches praised resilience, industry, cooperation. Samuel Crowe's name was mentioned once, in passing, as an example of how far hard work can take a man, not where it had taken the town. I watched Samuel leave his office late that evening, lights shutting down behind him methodically. He walked past the noise without turning his head. And that was when I understood the cost of what he had built. Samuel Crowe had escaped poverty, but he had not escaped memory. And the town, prosperous, grateful, careful to keep distance, had decided something without voting on it. They would accept his money. They would use his systems, but they would never forgive the man he used to be. Midwest Rivertown, 1925 to 1931. The crash did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like paperwork, notices, corrections, revisions written smaller each week. By the time people began calling it a collapse, Samuel Crowe had already stopped listening to names for it. He listened to numbers, to silence on the other end of telephones, to the way men stood a little longer before answering questions they once answered easily. Factories slowed, then stopped. Banks closed their doors with apologies that sounded rehearsed. Men who had once dismissed Samuel's restraint now found themselves begging for it. Samuel did not say, "I told you so." He didn't say anything. He adjusted. He had money when it mattered, not stored in a way that required permission. He owned land outright, machinery outright, inventory outright. He had no debts calling his name in the night. That made him dangerous in a different way, because when systems break, the men who prepared quietly begin to look suspicious. In 1930, the town council called an emergency meeting. Samuel was invited for the first time. The invitation arrived late and without ceremony, no seal, no signature worth noticing. He attended. The room smelled like panic and cheap tobacco. Men argued about solutions that required confidence they no longer possessed. Samuel listened the way he always had, with patience, not agreement. When they finally asked him to speak, it wasn't to lead, it was to lend. "Just until things stabilize," one man said. Samuel nodded. He asked questions. He requested terms in writing, not because he doubted them, but because he wanted the truth to survive memory. The loan went through. Businesses reopened that would have stayed closed otherwise. Payroll was met. Families ate. And still, Samuel remained an outsider. People accepted his money the way they accepted rain after a fire, grateful but resentful of dependence. They began saying his name differently, lower, shorter, with caution. "He's got a lot of leverage," they said, "for a man like him. For a man like him." That phrase did more work than any insult. In 1931, Samuel did something that should have rewritten his legacy. He bought the bank, not dramatically, through intermediaries, through quiet negotiations with men who had run out of choices. By the time the town realized ownership had changed hands, the paperwork was already filed. The bank reopened with minimal disruption. Depositors kept their accounts. Clerks kept their jobs. Samuel never sat at the main desk. He appointed others. men with softer edges, names the town trusted. Still, people knew. Money flowed through him now, whether they liked it or not. And yet, at social events, his chair remained empty. Children were warned about him in small ways. Be polite, Mother said, but don't get familiar. It baffled Samuel less than it might have baffled another man. Because Samuel understood a truth most people avoid. Reputation is slower than reality, and sometimes it never arrives at all. That winter, a factory owner approached him privately. They say you're controlling everything, the man said, half accusing, half hoping. Samuel considered correcting him, then didn't. Control, Samuel had learned, is a word people use when they're uncomfortable with clarity. I keep things working, Samuel replied. That was all. The factory stayed open. People stayed fed. Nothing changed about how Samuel was spoken of. In December, I saw him standing alone at the edge of the river, looking at the lights reflecting on water he once slept beside. He looked older, not weakened, just weathered by years no one acknowledged properly. I asked him once, carefully, "Do you regret it?" He didn't ask what it meant. "No," he said. "I regret thinking it would be visible." That was the closest he ever came to complaint. By the end of 1931, Samuel Crowe had more wealth than most men in the region. What he did not have, and never would, was absolution. The town had decided something long ago, and prosperity had not changed its mind. Samuel had risen from the mud, but the footprints he left behind had hardened into memory. Midwest River Town, 1932, 1945. By the time the country began preparing for another war, Samuel Crowe was no longer a curiosity. He was infrastructure. His name appeared in deeds, ledgers, and balance sheets that never left filing cabinets. His influence was embedded in processes rather than announcements. When shortages came, his warehouses were quietly unlocked. When transport stalled, his rail contacts rerouted shipments without conversation. People stopped saying his name in public debates. They spoke around him instead. That kind of silence is not respect. It is reliance without acknowledgement. In 1942, production quotas increased overnight. Factories that had barely survived the previous decade were suddenly essential again. Contracts returned with urgency, stamped with federal priority. Everyone scrambled, everyone except Samuel. He had already positioned his holdings so they could convert without disruption. Equipment he had purchased cheap years earlier was suddenly valuable. Storage yards he had bought to solve small problems became logistical anchors. The town prospered again, this time under pressure rather than hope. Posters went up, speeches were given, flags were raised. Samuel did not attend the ceremonies. Instead, he financed overtime. He advanced wages. He covered losses no one was authorized to admit. When a foundry nearly shut down due to material delays, Samuel arranged deliveries that saved dozens of jobs. He asked for nothing in return except reimbursement at cost. Someone asked him once why he didn't demand more. He answered simply, "Because this isn't the moment." The truth was more complicated. Samuel had learned that gratitude rarely compounds. It dissipates. By 1943, younger men had started calling him Mr. Crowe instead of just Crowe. It sounded like progress until you listened closely. The respect was formal, not personal. A title used to keep distance, not bridge it. When the town raised funds for war relief, Samuel donated more than anyone else. His name appeared in the paper, misspelled. No correction was issued. He did not ask for one. During an inspection that year, a federal official walked through one of Samuel's storage facilities and remarked quietly, "This place runs better than most state operations." Samuel nodded. That was enough. At night, when the town settled, Samuel walked the perimeter of his original lot near the cannery. The ground was firm now, paved, the weeds gone. I once asked him if it felt strange. "What?" he said. "To stand here," I replied. "After everything." He looked at the buildings, the lights, the men finishing shifts that depended on structures he had put into place long before they were necessary. "It feels accurate," he said. After the war ended, celebrations returned. Relief, pride, exhaustion, all layered into public memory. Samuel was not part of the story people told themselves. They spoke of effort, of unity, of collective strength. They did not speak of the man who made continuity possible when emotion replaced planning. That winter, the town council proposed a plaque commemorating resilience. Samuel funded it. His name did not appear on it. By then, he no longer expected it to, because Samuel Crowe had finally understood the exchange he had made, whether he intended to or not. He had traded visibility for durability, forgiveness for function. And in towns like this, function always outlives forgiveness. Midwest Rivertown, 1946-1954. After the war, the town tried to remember itself as it had been. It was an awkward process. Parades felt smaller. Promises felt heavier. Men returned older than they had left, carrying habits that did not fit easily into peacetime. Businesses reopened with careful optimism. The language of emergency faded, replaced by the language of growth. Samuel Crowe listened. He was in his 60s now, still upright, still precise. He had learned to move his body the way he moved capital, without waste. His fortune had grown large enough to become abstract. It existed less as cash and more as structures, property, logistics, influence embedded in decisions made by other people who never said his name aloud. No one asked him how much he was worth. That omission was intentional, because asking would have required acknowledging that Samuel Crowe was no longer an exception, he was a fact. In 1948, a Bayai regional paper ran an article ranking prominent business interests along the river. Samuel's holdings were mentioned across 3 paragraphs, carefully separated, as if listing them together would imply authorship. Readers could connect the dots if they wanted. Most did not. Samuel had learned something else by then. Once wealth passes a certain point, people prefer it to be impersonal. It makes them feel less implicated. In those years, I saw him often. I was a man by then, with a family of my own. Sometimes we walked together after dusk, not talking much. Silence had become his most reliable currency. One evening I asked him if he planned to slow down. "From what?" he asked. "There's the work," I said. He considered this. "I don't work," he replied. "I maintain." That was not modesty. It was accuracy. In 1950, a flood larger than the one years earlier threatened the lower quarter of town. Sirens sounded, meetings were called, arguments flared over responsibility. Before the council reached a decision, Samuel's crews were already in motion, reinforcing embankments, staging equipment, redirecting flow where they could. He had built contingency into his operations long before anyone called it foresight. The damage was limited, losses contained. People praised coordination, leadership, community response. They did not say his name. Later, someone joked at a diner, Funny how things always work out when Crowe's money is around. The table laughed, not cruelly, uneasily. By then, Samuel understood that humor was how people disguised relief they didn't want to admit dependence on. In 1952, Samuel revised his will, not because he was ill, because the order mattered to him. He allocated funds to institutions rather than people, schools, infrastructure, trusts with conditions he knew would never be publicly attributed to him. He did not want gratitude. He wanted continuity. A lawyer asked him once if he wished to establish a legacy foundation. Samuel shook his head. Names fade, he said. Systems don't. That answer unsettled the lawyer more than refusal would have. Samuel no longer drank, hadn't for decades. That fact was now part of town lore, though spoken as if it were a rumor still being verified. He used to, people said. But you know how stories get. They like that version better. A redeemed failure is comforting. A successful repair that never apologizes is not. By 1954, Samuel's presence had become paradoxical. He was everywhere in effect, nowhere in recognition. Children passed buildings he had financed without knowing it. Workers clocked in, using systems he had stabilized long before they were born. Civic leaders debated future projects on ground he had quietly purchased and reallocated. No one asked Samuel how he felt about any of it, and Samuel, long past expecting the question, did not volunteer. One evening that year, as we stood near the river where he had once slept, I asked him something I had carried for years. Do you think it was worth it? He did not answer immediately. Then he said, For me? Yes. He looked at the lights reflected in water that no longer smelled of waste. For them, he added, they never asked. That was the last time I heard him speak in terms of worth, because by then, Samuel Crowe had crossed the final threshold. He had become a man whose fortune no longer needed explanation, and whose absence someday would be noticed only after nothing stopped working. Midwest River Town, 1955-1961. By the late 1950s, the town ran smoothly enough that no one remembered how difficult it had once been to keep it that way. That is the final stage of stability. When maintenance becomes invisible, people begin to treat it as nature. Samuel Crowe was nearly 80 when that shift completed itself. His hair had gone thin and gray. His steps were slower, but still measured. He no longer visited his properties regularly. He did not need to. Systems he had designed to outlast personality had begun doing exactly that. Managers rotated, councils changed, policies were revised and renamed. The outcomes stayed consistent. When a freight delay occurred, it resolved itself before anyone thought to panic. When a contractor failed, another appeared already briefed. When a small crisis formed, it dissolved quietly into procedure. People praised efficiency. They did not ask where it came from. In 1957, a journalist from the city arrived to write a piece on regional growth. He interviewed officials, business leaders, longtime residents. He asked earnest questions about cooperation, innovation, shared responsibility. Samuel was not interviewed, not out of malice, because no one thought of him as a story anymore. The article mentioned several companies Samuel owned, in different sections, under different headings. To the reader, they appeared unrelated. The connective tissue was invisible. That invisibility pleased Samuel more than recognition ever could have, because by then, recognition would have asked the wrong question. In 1958, a small manufacturing firm attempted to expand beyond its capacity and collapsed under mismanagement. Workers feared layoffs. Suppliers froze accounts. Samuel's office released a statement that the facilities would be absorbed under existing holdings. Employment continued. Losses were contained. No press followed. At a diner, someone remarked, "Funny how nothing ever really falls apart around here." Another replied, "Guess we're just lucky." Luck is what people call preparation they didn't witness. That year, Samuel fell once while walking the embankment. Nothing dramatic, no broken bones. But afterward, he began using a cane, not for support, but for rhythm. He had always moved to a rhythm. Alcohol had once disrupted it. Work restored it. Now age slowed it evenly. We walked, together less often. When we did, our conversation shortened, not because there was less to say, because Samuel had finished saying what mattered. In 1960, the town announced a new long-term development plan. A councilman praised modern thinking and forward-looking investment. Samuel's name did not appear in the meeting minutes. He read them anyway. He noticed what had been removed. Contingencies simplified, safeguards abbreviated, assumptions inserted where verification once lived. This concerned him, not because it endangered him, because it revealed something about memory. When people forget hardship, they mistake stability for inevitability. Samuel requested a private meeting with 2 council members. He spoke softly. He asked specific questions. He warned without dramatizing. They thanked him politely. Nothing changed. That was new. Samuel returned home and revised his will again. He shifted funds from operational trusts into irreversible endowments, money that could not be redirected based on moods or elections, systems that would persist even after wisdom faded. He did not explain this to anyone. Explanations invite interference. By 1961, Samuel spent most evenings at his desk reviewing summaries rather than details. The work no longer excited him. It reassured him. One afternoon, he paused mid-sentence and stared at the ledger in front of him. For the first time in decades, something felt unfinished. Not a deal, not an account, a thought. The town functioned perfectly well without thinking about him. That was the goal, but it came with a consequence no one had prepared for. If no one remembered why things worked, no one would protect the conditions that made them work. Samuel closed the ledger gently. That evening, he said to me almost casually, "They don't remember the weight anymore." I asked what he meant. "The ground feels solid," he said, "so they forget what it takes to keep it that way." He did not sound angry. He sounded observational. Like a man noting weather patterns he would not be alive to see change again. Outside, the river moved steadily. Clean now, predictable. The town had finally reached the stage Samuel had worked toward his entire life. It functioned without him being noticed, and that meant the last thing he could do for it was prepare it for what comes after people stop remembering how stability is built. Midwest River Town, 1962–1965. Samuel Crowe died on a Tuesday. That detail mattered to the town more than any other part of the announcement. Tuesday meant banks were open, factories were running, offices were staffed. There would be no interruption. The notice appeared in the local paper beneath the weather and above an advertisement for farm equipment. Short, factual, respectful in tone, restrained in scope. Samuel had requested it that way years earlier. No titles, no summaries, no narrative, just a name, a date, and a line that described him as a local businessman. That was accurate enough. When the news reached City Hall, there was a pause, not silence. Activity continued, but a subtle recalibration. Meetings proceeded with a slight delay. A few calls were made that ended faster than usual. Then everything resumed. No system failed. No account froze. No payroll missed a cycle. No delivery stalled. That was the measure of Samuel Crowe's life more than any obituary could have been. He had built things so thoroughly that his absence did not register as an event. At the funeral, attendance was high. Not emotional, complete. People came because they felt they should, not because they felt they must. Men he had employed decades earlier nodded solemnly. Younger ones looked curious, trying to attach meaning to a figure they had only known as a background constant. There were no speeches. Samuel had forbidden them. The pastor read a passage about stewardship and restraint, about planting trees whose shade you might never sit under. Several people glanced at one another, unsure if the metaphor was intentional. Afterward, people lingered briefly. Then they left, not rudely, efficiently. I stayed longer than most. I stood near the edge of the lot and watched the town continue moving in the distance. Traffic flowing, doors opening, work resuming. It occurred to me then that Samuel had finally succeeded in the one ambition he never stated aloud. He had made himself unnecessary. In the weeks that followed, there were rumors that Samuel had left a fortune larger than expected, that his will contained conditions, that certain people would benefit more than others. None of it caused disruption, because Samuel had not left wealth in forms that required explanation. He had converted money into stability, trusts paid out on schedules no one could alter, endowments funded maintenance automatically, properties transferred to stewardship boards with narrowly defined powers. People kept working. Invoices were paid, repairs conducted, jobs preserved. If anyone felt relief, they did not say so. If anyone felt resentment, they hid it. The town moved on. Months later, a councilman remarked during a meeting, "It's impressive how well things were set up." No one responded. There was nothing to add. By autumn, Samuel's name was spoken less frequently, not out of disrespect, but because nothing required reference anymore. His work had finally disappeared into function. That winter, a minor equipment failure shut down a factory line for several hours. It was repaired promptly. Procedures followed. Costs absorbed. People called it an anomaly. Samuel would have called it proof. Proof that systems could bend without breaking. Proof that memory was no longer necessary. One evening, as I walked along the river, clean now, banked and reinforced, I realized I could no longer locate the exact spot where Samuel had once slept. The ground had been leveled, paved, reassigned. I tried to explain this to someone once. They nodded, polite but disengaged. "It's a good thing the town changed," they said. "Yes," I replied, "it is." What I didn't say was that change has a way of erasing the labor that makes it possible. By the end of 1965, Samuel Crowe had become a historical footnote, remembered vaguely, credited broadly, understood narrowly, and that too was by his design. He had known something long before anyone else cared to learn it, that wealth can build structures, that discipline can sustain them, but only forgetting can make them permanent. I am older now than Samuel ever was when I first met him. That has given me a strange advantage. Not clarity, distance. When you live long enough, you stop looking for moments where things change. You start noticing when they don't. Samuel Crowe did not build monuments. He built continuities. The town never thanked him because gratitude requires memory, and memory fades faster than systems ever do. What Samuel understood long before anyone needed to hear it was this: people forgive failure more easily than they forgive improvement. They celebrate visible struggle more than quiet correction, and they are far more comfortable with redemption stories than they are with people who simply stop being what they were and move on. Samuel climbed out of the mud without asking to be seen. He built wealth without asking for respect. He stabilized lives without asking for gratitude. And in return, the town gave him exactly what it gives everyone who changes faster than its memory can update: silence. Not cruel silence, not angry silence, functional silence. The kind that allows things to keep working without asking who made them work. Years after his death, I once heard a man say, "Funny how towns like ours just seem to run themselves." He meant it as praise. What he didn't know, what he didn't need to know, was how many decisions had been made long ago so he could say that sentence without irony. Samuel Crowe became wealthy. He became influential. He became indispensable. And then he disappeared so completely into the structure of things that his absence caused no disruption at all. That was his final achievement, not success, not redemption, but erasure so thorough it felt like permanence. If there is a lesson here, it isn't about money. It isn't even about change. It's about this: a system will always accept your contribution. It may never accept you. And the more perfectly it works, the faster it forgets who made it possible. Samuel Crowe died knowing that, and the town lived on, stable, efficient, unaware, exactly the way he designed it to. Sometimes the true measure of a life isn't what stops when it ends, but what continues as if it never had to.